Hey everyone, tonight we're going to drift all the way back through history. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and if you're already half asleep, perfect. That's the exact mood for tonight's slow unraveling of human cleanliness. Or well, the lack of it. Because let's be honest, the Victorians, for all their lace manners and moral lectures, were basically living in a perfume-scented cloud of filth. It's the 1800s. Coal smoke fogs the air, horse manure carpets the streets, and everyone's pretending that lavender water counts as hygiene. So let's take a slow, slightly disgusted stroll through Victorian hygiene, the age of invention, illusion, and quite a few diseases with dramatic names. The illusion of cleanliness. When we think of the Victorian era, we tend to imagine those crisp white dresses, polished shoes and spotless marble halls. But that's mostly how it looked, not how it smelled. The truth is, most Victorians weren't bathing every day, not even every week. Water was heavy, heating it was expensive, and indoor plumbing was a luxury. So for the average Londoner, taking a bath meant maybe once a month. And that's if you were lucky enough to have a tub and the patience to boil gallons of water on the stove first. And even then, entire families sometimes shared the same bath water. Dad went first, then Mum, then the kids in order of seniority. And by the time it got to the youngest, it was less of a bath and more of a lukewarm soup of family history. But Victorians had solutions. For instance, dry washing. That meant rubbing yourself down with a towel and calling it good enough. Some people sprinkled talc or scented powders to hide the smell. Others just leaned heavily on perfume, because if you can't get clean, you can at least smell aggressively floral while being dirty. The great toilet problem. Let's talk about toilets, because the Victorians didn't have great ones. In the early 19th century, most homes didn't have indoor plumbing. You'd either use a chamber pot under the bed, a charming porcelain bucket for your nightly business, or head to a privy, basically an outhouse that was occasionally emptied, and more often not. And where did all that waste go? Into the rivers, specifically the Thames. By the 1850s, London's main river had become a flowing stew of sewage, industrial waste, and dead animals. People called it the Great Stink. Yes, that's a real historical event. The Great Stink of 1858, when the smell was so unbearable that Parliament literally had to hang curtains soaked in lime and vinegar just to keep functioning, and this was around the same time they were debating sanitation reform. Coincidence? Probably not. Soap. The class divide soap, you might think, would be the simplest part of hygiene. But Victorian soap was a surprisingly elite affair. Until the mid-century, soap was taxed like a luxury item. That meant poorer people simply couldn't afford it. Or if they could, they used it sparingly. You'd have a single rough bar of brown, lye-heavy soap that doubled as body wash, dish soap, and sometimes laundry detergent. For wealthier families, however, bathing was practically performance art. Elaborate soaps were perfumed with rose, lavender, or violet. There were toilet waters, lotions, and even early versions of deodorant powders. Still, even rich people didn't bathe as much as we do. Many preferred to wash by sponging down key areas, face, neck, hands, and assumed that their high social status somehow prevented bacteria. It didn't. The laundry dilemma. Now imagine doing laundry in an age before washing machines. It was a full-day operation. You'd boil water, scrub everything by hand, hang it to dry, and then iron it for hours. Most people just wore the same outer clothes again and again, swapping out only the underlayers when they could. Which is why chemises and linen undershirts were so important. They absorbed sweat and grime, protecting the fancier clothes on top. In theory, that meant you didn't have to wash your dress or coat as often. In reality, it just meant you were wearing slightly cleaner layers of dirt. But hey, it was socially acceptable dirt. When clean water became a privilege, one of the darkest aspects of Victorian hygiene was the water supply. Even as cities expanded and factories multiplied, clean water wasn't guaranteed. The same rivers used for bathing and washing were also used for dumping sewage. Cholera outbreaks were common. In fact, the Victorians originally thought cholera came from bad air or miasma. It wasn't until Dr. John Snow, yes, that's his real name, but no, he didn't know nothing, mapped cholera deaths in London in 1854, that people realized the disease was waterborne. He traced it to a single pump on Broad Street. When they removed the handle, the outbreak stopped. A very literal solution to a very deadly problem. Cosmetics, cures, and pseudoscience. Of course, Victorians loved a good miracle product, and hygiene was often tied to health tonics, beauty elixirs, and questionable science. You could buy powders claiming to purify the complexion, soaps that restored moral purity, and tonics that allegedly cleansed the blood. Some of them contained mercury. Some had lead. A few even had arsenic, because apparently poisoning yourself in small doses was the price of clear skin. And people actually did it. Arsenic wafers were sold to women as beauty aids for that pale, luminous complexion. Because nothing says elegance like mild internal organ failure. The scent of a Victorian home, let's not forget the smell of the home itself. Candles made of animal fat, open fireplaces, coal dust, damp walls, and occasionally the unmistakable aroma of whatever was wafting in from the street, which might include horse dung, sewage, or the fishmonger's latest batch. To mask all this, Victorians used potpourri, burning herbs, and endless amounts of perfume. You didn't fix bad air. You just covered it with something stronger, a bit like spraying deodorant in a room that's already past saving. The myth of the clean city public hygiene reforms eventually came, but slowly. The new sewer systems designed by engineer Joseph Basil Gett in the late 1850s finally began cleaning up London. Hospitals started understanding germ theory. Soap became cheaper after the tax was lifted in 1853. And yet, even by the end of the century, city life still wasn't exactly fresh. People dumped trash in the streets, rats thrived, and smog hung over everything like a permanent grey scarf. But the Victorians did something remarkable. They believed they were cleaner than ever before, and in a way they were. Just not by our standards. Let's float gently from the reeking streets of 19th century London to something a little more appetizing. Or, depending on your stomach, maybe not. Next, we'll step back further in time, to ancient Rome, where hygiene, feasting, and gladiator games all mixed into one strange cultural soup of excess and spectacle. Because if the Victorians smelled like soap and smog, the Romans smelled like olive oil, wine, and probably other things we shouldn't describe before bedtime. Hey there again. If you're still awake, that's impressive. But if you're drifting a little, that's fine too. Because ancient Rome isn't the kind of place you rush through. It's a place you wander, past the fountains, through the crowded markets, down to the baths, and maybe stop for some bread and olives along the way. Tonight we're going to explore what Romans ate, how they ate it, and how somehow, between feasts, vomitoriums, and gladiator fights, they thought they were the most civilized people on earth. Spoiler, they kind of were, but also kind of weren't. Bread in the backbone of Rome. Let's start with something simple. Bread was to Romans what Wi-Fi is to us. It wasn't just food. It was a necessity, a symbol of civilization. They even had a phrase for it, panem et circenses, meaning bread and circuses. Feed the people, entertain them, and they won't complain. The average Roman ate bread every single day, usually made from wheat if you were wealthy, or barley if you weren't. Sometimes it was coarse and full of grit, because the millstones would shed tiny flakes of rock into the flour. So yes, the Roman working class literally ate dusty, tooth-destroying bread. But bread wasn't just food. It was politics. During the late Republic and Empire, the government handed out free or subsidized grain to keep the city's population calm. Think of it as ancient welfare. Except instead of direct payments, you got a bag of flour and a seat at the next chariot race. It worked surprisingly well. Because when your diet is 80% carbs and 20% gossip, life feels manageable. Olive oil and the art of grease next up. Olive oil, the Roman liquid gold. They used it for cooking, of course, but also for cleaning, lighting lamps, moisturizing skin, and probably about 10 other uses that modern marketing would call multi-purpose wellness. You'd pour olive oil on food, on your hair, even on your body at the bathhouse, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. That was considered cleansing. Technically, it worked. Kind of. If you were a gladiator, though, your oil-slicked sweat was actually collected and sold in little bottles as a beauty product. People believed it had restorative powers. Yes, you heard that right. Gladiator sweat as skincare. So if you've ever bought something labeled ancient-inspired or Roman formula at Sephora, well, let's just hope it's not that authentic. The Roman feast, gluttony in slow motion. Now let's enter the dining room, the triclinium. Imagine 3 couches arranged around a low table. Guests reclined sideways, propped on one elbow, and ate with their fingers. Knives and forks weren't really a thing, just spoons and a lot of grabbing. Feasts could last hours, even days. You'd start with appetizers, eggs, olives, honeyed nuts, then move to the main courses. Roasted meats, fish in garum, that's fermented fish sauce, like ancient Roman ketchup, and platters of fruit drenched in wine. The host's goal was to impress, to show wealth, taste, and social power, not restraint. There were dishes made of dormice stuffed with pork and herbs, flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and the occasional eel cooked in honey and wine. Because nothing says refinement like eating an animal famous for screaming while it dies, wine Romans didn't just like wine, they practically worshipped it. Everyone drank it, but never straight. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric, something only northern tribes did. So they mixed it with water, spices, and sometimes honey. The result was less party fuel and more hydrated buzz. Slaves poured it continuously at banquets, while musicians played, poets recited verses, and philosophers rambled about virtue between bites of roasted pheasant. And when the room got too stuffy, guests might step out into a courtyard filled with fountains, perfumed smoke, and probably a few drunk senators debating the meaning of life in togas that had seen better days. About those vomitoriums. Okay, time for one myth. You've probably heard that Romans had special rooms called vomitoriums, where they'd go to vomit during feasts, so they could keep eating. Sadly, or thankfully, that's not quite true. A vomitorium was actually just an architectural term for the passageways that allowed crowds to spew out of an amphitheater. However, that doesn't mean no one ever did the whole eat, purge, repeat routine. Wealthy Romans were absolutely known to overindulge and then find relief so they could return to the table. They just didn't build a special room for it. So while vomitorium might be a misunderstanding, the spirit of it, the endless cycle of consumption, was very real. Bread, circuses, and gladiators. Speaking of amphitheaters, let's take a slow stroll toward the Colosseum, because food and entertainment were 2 halves of the same Roman obsession. The state literally fed and amused the masses to maintain control. Free grain, free games, thousands of people packed into the arena, munching bread and fruit, watching as men fought to the death, all under the blazing sun of imperial glory. The gladiators themselves had their own diets. They were often called hordiari, barley men, because they ate a mostly vegetarian diet heavy on barley, beans, and ash-based tonics to build muscle. It sounds like a nightmare smoothie, but apparently it worked. And while the crowd cheered, vendors sold snacks, sausages, pastries, nuts, wine. Imagine a deadly sports match combined with a farmer's market. Only bloodier and with worse crowd control. Roman kitchens and everyday life let's drift away from the feasts of emperors and look into a more ordinary Roman home. Your average family didn't have fancy dining rooms. They cooked on small charcoal stoves, often outdoors or in cramped courtyards. Bread might be baked at communal ovens. You'd knead your dough at home and then carry it down the street to the baker's, marked with your family's seal so it wouldn't get mixed up. Breakfast, orientaculum, was light, usually bread dipped in wine or olive oil. Lunch was simple, cold leftovers, fruit, maybe cheese. Dinner cena was the main meal, but still modest, unless you were rich enough to throw a party. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was identity. Romans prided themselves on being moderate, at least in theory. They liked to contrast themselves with barbarian cultures that supposedly ate raw meat or drank too much. But let's be real. By the late Empire, moderation was long gone. Feasts had become competitions of wealth, and digestion was an afterthought. Seasoning, sauces, and questionable tastes. One thing the Romans absolutely loved: garum. It was their all-purpose condiment, a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish guts, salt, and herbs in the sun for weeks. It smelled exactly like you think it would, but they put it on everything. Garum factories were so pungent that they were often built outside city limits, which tells you everything you need to know. They also enjoyed exotic spices from across the empire: pepper from India, cinnamon from Arabia, saffron from Spain. Having these ingredients was a flex. You were literally eating the empire's reach, the emperor's appetite now. No story about Roman feasting would be complete without mentioning the emperors, the ultimate consumers. Take Vitellius, for example. He ruled for less than a year, but managed to become legendary for his appetite. He reportedly ate 3 or 4 enormous meals a day, and once served a dish containing the livers of pike, pheasants, and flamingos all stewed together. Then there was Elagabalus, the teenage emperor who loved bizarre banquets. He'd serve peas mixed with gold dust, or dishes where all the food was the same color. At one feast, he supposedly smothered his guests with rose petals falling from the ceiling. It sounds poetic until you realize some of them suffocated. And then there's Nero, who wasn't much better. He'd invite hundreds to his garden parties, dine by torchlight, and sing about his own greatness, while eating oysters and figs. When Rome burned, he allegedly sang again. Not the most self-aware dinner host. Cleanliness, Roman style. Before we move on from Rome, let's touch on hygiene, because surprisingly they were obsessed with it. The Romans had public bathhouses everywhere. Grand complexes with pools of different temperatures, massage rooms, even libraries and snack bars. Men and women bathed daily, scraping oil and dirt from their skin, chatting, gossiping, maybe doing business deals between dips. It was part of life. Cleaner, honestly, than most later centuries managed. Still, not everything was pristine. Shared water, reused oil, and communal sponges for toilet paper? Yes. Sponges on sticks dipped in vinegar. All make you think twice about calling them advanced. But compared to the Victorians, the Romans were practically spa-goers. Let's take one last slow breath under the Roman sun and drift forward in time again. Not to dirty London this time, but to the calm, stoic mind of one of Rome's most thoughtful emperors. He didn't throw feasts. He didn't burn cities. He just wrote down his thoughts. Next, we'll meet Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, emperor, and reluctant ruler of the known world. Hey everyone, still here? Still awake? No worries if you're not. Marcus Aurelius would probably approve of that. He believed in accepting what is natural, and honestly, falling asleep during a history video feels pretty natural. So tonight, let's settle in with one of the calmest emperors Rome ever produced. The man who ruled a world of chaos by quietly telling himself not to lose his cool, because Marcus Aurelius wasn't born for the throne. He was born for the library. He'd have been perfectly happy sitting in a corner, reading Greek philosophy, sipping watered wine, and occasionally staring into the middle distance like every great thinker does. But history, as usual, had other plans. The boy who read too much, Marcus, was born in the year 121 CE, during the height of Rome's power. It was the era of marble cities, stable borders, and emperors with decent self-control. For a while, anyway. His family was wealthy but not royal. His father died when he was young, so he was raised mostly by his mother and grandfather. Both strict, both moral, both very Roman about everything. He was adopted by Emperor Antoninus Pius later in life, which basically made him the designated heir. And that was fine, except Marcus had what we might call bookworm energy. He wasn't the conquering type. He was the take notes during battle type. His teachers noticed early that he preferred logic to luxury. While other kids were practicing speeches or swordplay, Marcus was out here writing reflections like, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." In other words, the kid was journaling his way into Stoicism before it was cool. Stoicism for the sleep-deprived. Let's pause for a moment on that word. Stoicism. It sounds intense, but it's basically ancient mindfulness, with worse marketing. The Stoics believe that you can't control what happens around you, only how you respond. Pain, fame, failure, success, all temporary. What matters is virtue, self-discipline, and keeping your internal peace when life goes off the rails. And life did go off the rails, because the Roman Empire had a habit of turning even calm philosophers into reluctant micromanagers of chaos. From philosopher to emperor in 161 CE, Antoninus Pius died, and Marcus became emperor, along with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus. It was one of those joint leadership arrangements that sound harmonious in theory and go badly in every group project. Lucius was outgoing, impulsive, and more interested in feasts than philosophy. Marcus was quiet, thoughtful, and probably already writing notes like, "Remember, even fools are part of nature." Still, Marcus didn't rebel. He just quietly managed the empire while Lucius handled public appearances and, let's be honest, the after-parties. The empire gets complicated. The good times didn't last. Almost immediately, trouble began. There were wars on the eastern borders, and a plague, possibly smallpox, that swept through the empire and killed millions. Marcus spent most of his reign either fighting wars or writing meditations in tents somewhere in Germany. Which, to be fair, is a very Stoic setting. He kept journals, just private notes, really, to remind himself not to lose hope or patience. Those notes would later become the Meditations, one of the most famous philosophical books ever written. He didn't write them for an audience. He didn't even plan to publish them. They were reminders to himself, like, when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, "The people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they cannot tell good from evil. Basically, brace yourself, it's Monday." The emperor's inner life, Marcus's private writings make him feel strangely modern. He worried about time slipping away, about ego, about being good enough. He was constantly reminding himself to stay calm, kind, and humble, despite being the literal ruler of the known world. He wasn't flashy. He didn't build golden palaces or burn cities for fun. He lived simply, dressed plainly, and kept his family close. Well, as close as possible, given how imperial families usually turned out. His wife Faustina gets mixed reviews from history. Some say she was loyal. Others say she had a thing for gladiators. Marcus, being Stoic, probably just sighed and wrote something like, "Do not be angry with the world. It is only doing what the world does, which is philosophers speak for. It's fine. I'm fine. Everything's fine." Duty over desire. What makes Marcus interesting isn't that he was perfect. Far from it. It's that he didn't want to be emperor, but did it anyway because he felt it was his duty. He'd rather have been in Athens discussing ethics. Instead, he was out in muddy camps, dealing with supply shortages and rebellious tribes. There's something deeply human about that, doing your best in a role you didn't choose, trying to stay kind while everyone around you is losing their minds. He once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." That's Marcus in a nutshell. No drama, no glory. Just quiet perseverance. The wars that wouldn't end, the Marcomannic Wars, dragged on for years. Freezing winters, endless marches, soldiers dying of disease. Not exactly the philosopher's retreat he'd hoped for. Still, Marcus led by example. He slept on the ground with his troops, ate their food, and refused luxuries. Even the enemy respected him, and somehow in between all of that he kept writing. By torchlight in cold tents, scribbling thoughts like, "You could leave life right now." Let that determine what you do and say and think. It wasn't morbid, just realistic. For Marcus, every day was a reminder that nothing lasts. Not victory, not pain, not even empires. The air problem, and yet, for all his wisdom, Marcus made one very unstoic mistake. He left the empire to his son Commodus. Yes, that Commodus, the one who later fancied himself a gladiator, wore lion skins, and basically treated Rome like his personal wrestling ring. It's a tragic contrast. Marcus, the calm philosopher, Commodus, the chaotic showman. You could almost say Marcus spent his life mastering self-control, only to pass the torch to a man who thought self-control was optional. Still, Marcus never publicly criticized his son. He probably just closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and reminded himself, "You cannot control what others do, only your own reasoned choices." The end of a Stoic Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, probably of the same plague that haunted his reign. He was in his late 50s, still on campaign, still writing. He didn't want monuments or songs. He wanted peace, internal peace most of all. After his death, the empire entered a slow decline. Historians often mark his passing as the end of Rome's golden age. It's almost poetic. The philosopher king dies, and everything unravels. But Marcus would have just shrugged and said, "Everything is ephemeral, so fame, the memory of men, and even the names of those who remember you. In other words, don't worry about it. Just do your best while you're here." His quiet legacy today, the Meditations, still sits on nightstands and therapy shelves everywhere, read by CEOs, monks, and insomniacs alike. It's not flashy. It's not dramatic. It's just a man trying to stay calm in a world that wouldn't let him rest. And maybe that's why his words still work. Because 2,000 years later, we're all still doing the same thing, trying to find a little serenity amid the noise. Marcus found it, at least some of the time. And if he didn't, he forgave himself for that too. So as we close tonight's slow march through empires, feasts, and baths, remember this. Cleanliness changes. Empires fall. Bread gets stale. But the quiet pursuit of peace, and that's timeless. And if you're already half asleep right now, well, congratulations. You've achieved exactly what Marcus Aurelius would have wanted. Serenity without effort. Hey again. If you're still here, or half here, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our gentle wander through the ancient world. And this time, we're sitting down at the table But not just any table. This one's marble, lined with silver plates, amphorae of wine, servants waiting quietly at the edges of the lamplight. It's Rome again, but not the bread and barley kind of Rome. This is the upper crust. The elite, the people who made eating weirdly competitive. Let's take a calm, disgusted look. When food became status for most Romans, the farmers, soldiers, laborers, food was survival. Bread, porridge, olives, beans, maybe fish if you lived near the sea, but for the wealthy, eating was theatre. A way to show power, money, and how far your trade ships could go without sinking. They didn't just want good food. They wanted rare food. The stranger, the better. If your dinner came from halfway across the empire and looked vaguely endangered, you were winning. Flamingos, peacocks, and other questionable choices. So what exactly counted as a delicacy in ancient Rome? Well, brace your modern taste buds, because it's not cheese platters and sourdough. One imperial favorite was flamingo tongue. Yes, the tongue. It was considered tender, elegant, and symbolically refined. Peacock brains, too, made the menu, often served as a luxury dish for those who wanted to taste beauty. And because everything had to be extravagant, they'd sometimes pluck the feathers, roast the bird, and then redress it in its feathers before serving. Because nothing says sophistication like eating something that looks freshly reanimated, there was also dormouse, a fat little rodent considered a delicacy. They were kept in special terracotta jars called gliraria to be fattened up before cooking. They'd be stuffed with pork, honey, and herbs, roasted, and served as bite-sized luxury snacks. If you're imagining ancient hors d'oeuvres, you're not wrong, just slightly nauseated. It's early morning in Rome, though morning is generous. The sun hasn't really climbed up yet. The air still smells faintly of last night's fires, and someone's laundry from 3 floors above is dripping on you. Welcome to your new life. You're an average Roman citizen. Not poor, not rich, just somewhere in the middle. You rent a room in an insula, a multi-story apartment block made of questionable brickwork and a lot of wishful thinking. If you live on the top floor, congratulations. You pay less rent, but you also have a higher chance of dying in a fire. It's a very Roman kind of trade-off. Morning routine, 1st century edition. You wake up to the sound of street vendors shouting. There's no alarm clock, no coffee machine, and no privacy. Just the thin wooden wall separating your family from your neighbor who snores like an ox. Breakfast is simple. Maybe a chunk of bread dipped in watered-down wine or olive oil. Romans weren't really breakfast people. They treated it more like fuel, something you grab on the way to surviving the day. No toothpaste, no showers. You rinse your face in a basin, scrape your teeth with a stick, and hope your breath offends fewer people than usual. If you're feeling fancy, you might use a dab of perfume oil. Romans loved perfume. They imported it from Arabia, Egypt, and India, and wore enough of it to make modern fragrance counters look subtle. Off to work begins early. For most men, that means heading out into the streets, maybe to a shop, a stall, or a construction site. The noise is constant. Hammering, hawking, hooves, street barbers shouting deals next to bakers, who somehow always look covered in soot and pride. If you're an artisan, your workshop might double as your living space. One tiny room with tools, a fire pit, and a few jars of who knows what. If you're a merchant, you pray your goods arrive on time and that the tax collector forgets your name. And if you're a teacher, good luck. Roman kids weren't known for their attention spans, and parents paid you in whatever they thought counted as currency that week. The lunch situation, lunch, or prandium, comes around midday. You probably grab something simple. Cold leftovers, a piece of cheese, maybe olives or nuts. If you're richer, you might have slaves to fetch it for you. If not, you just sit on a step and hope the bread's not too stale. And if you're working near the Forum, You might stop by a thermopolium, basically an ancient fast food counter. They served hot soups, stews and wine, poured from big clay pots sunk into marble counters. Some had frescoes showing their menu, kind of like a McDonald's, but with fewer lawsuits. For the women of Rome now, if you're a Roman woman, your day depends entirely on your social class. If you're wealthy, you probably spend the morning supervising slaves, managing the household accounts, and making sure the wool is spun. You might visit the baths later, meet friends, or attend a temple ceremony. If you're not wealthy, you're working, maybe at the market, maybe laundering clothes in stinking vats of urine. Yes, really, ammonia was free and effective, or sewing in a cramped little workshop. Either way, you're multitasking your way through the empire with zero recognition and a lot of laundry. Bath time, everyone's favorite. By late afternoon, when the sun's glaring and everyone smells like they've been alive too long, people start drifting toward the public baths, the social heart of Roman life. Bathhouses weren't just for washing, they were for gossip, business deals, and pretending you didn't notice your senator neighbor walking by completely naked. For a small fee, you got access to warm rooms, tepidarium, hot rooms, caldarium, and cold plunges, frigidarium. You'd oil your skin, scrape it off with a curved bronze tool called a strigil, and chat about politics while someone yelled about the latest chariot race. It was oddly democratic. Rich and poor, slaves and senators, everyone soaked in the same pools, at least in theory. Though, as always, some baths were more exclusive than others. Evening return as twilight settles. You make your way home through streets lit by flickering oil lamps. The air's heavy with smoke and the faint smell of stew. Dinner or cena is the main meal. If you're middle class, you might share lentils, bread, olives, maybe a bit of fish or sausage if it's been a good week. You eat reclining on low couches, chatting lazily, pretending you're in a fresco even though you're sitting next to a broken jug. If you're poor, your dinner's simpler. Porridge, beans, bread. But you still gather, talk, complain about the price of grain, and enjoy the small warmth of having made it through another Roman day. Nightlife, Roman style now. If you're the kind of person who doesn't like going straight to bed, the night offers options. You might head to a tavern. Hot popine were everywhere, smoky, loud and full of dice games, wine, and the occasional argument that turned into a stabbing. Or if you're upper class, you might attend a dinner party, convivium, where poets read verses no one asked for, and someone inevitably brags about their new villa. If you're lucky, you catch a play at the theatre, or a performance at the amphitheatre, though those could get rowdy. Romans loved their entertainment loud and occasionally dangerous, but for most people, night just means darkness. There are no streetlights beyond a few torches, no sound except dogs, footsteps, and the occasional cart rumbling past. You close your shutters, curl up on a straw mattress, and hope the building doesn't collapse before morning. The quiet details. Despite the grandeur of the empire, daily Roman life was simple. People worked, ate, bathed, worried about taxes, gossiped about neighbors, prayed for better luck. They might visit shrines on their way home, light a small lamp for household gods, the lares and penates, whispering thanks or requests, health, prosperity, maybe a quiet day tomorrow. Even emperors did the same, in their own overcomplicated way, sacrificing bulls instead of bread. But the sentiment was familiar. At its core, Rome wasn't marble or military conquest. It was millions of small routines, laundry, gossip, food, and fatigue, stitched together across centuries. Night falls on the empire. As the lamps go out and the city exhales, the sound of Rome settles into something like a heartbeat. Crickets, footsteps, whispers. Somewhere a drunk shouts a half-remembered poem into the dark. And maybe, If you tilt your imagination just right, you can almost feel it. The warmth of clay walls, the faint ache of tired muscles, the smell of olive oil and dust. The empire was vast, yes, but every day still ended the same way, with people trying to rest, to forget, to dream a little before dawn demanded they start over. The ancient Romans had a saying, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. It was their version of keep people fed and distracted, and they won't question too much. And honestly, it worked. For centuries, the empire was built on conquest and taxes, yes, but it was sustained by entertainment. Feasts, festivals, races, fights, theatre, and the occasional lion eating an underpaid actor. It was chaos disguised as culture. But let's not rush it. Let's float through it like spectators, quietly, half amused, half horrified. The bread part, let's start with the basics. The bread. Literal bread. Rome fed over 1 million people at its peak, and most of them couldn't afford much. So the government handed out free grain, a monthly ration called the annona. It wasn't generosity, it was social control. A hungry population was dangerous. A fed one was just tired enough to stay loyal. The grain ships came from Egypt, packed with wheat from the Nile Delta, the empire's lifeline. When storms delayed them, people panicked. When grain prices rose, riots broke out. So emperors learned quickly, don't mess with the food supply. Better yet, distract the people while you fix it. Hence, the circuses. The grain ships came from Egypt, packed with wheat from the Nile Delta, the empire's lifeline. When storms delayed them, people panicked. When grain prices rose, riots broke out. So emperors learned quickly, don't mess with the food supply. Better yet, distract the people while you fix it. Hence, the circuses. The Circus Maximus. Now, when you hear circus, you probably imagine clowns and elephants. Rome had neither. But it did have chariot races, the most dangerous sport of the ancient world, short of being a Roman emperor. The Circus Maximus was enormous. 250,000 people could fit inside. That's roughly 3 modern football stadiums mashed together and filled with shouting Romans. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and cheap perfume. Vendors sold wine, olives, nuts, and questionable sausages. People gambled on the races, waved colored banners, and screamed themselves hoarse. There were 4 racing teams, the Reds, Blues, Greens, and Whites, each with fan bases that made modern sports rivalries look like polite tea parties. Fights broke out constantly. Entire neighborhoods aligned with teams. The emperor, sitting in his fancy box seat, would wave casually while the crowd chanted his name, or didn't. He paid close attention to which team they favored. Politics often hid behind the guise of sport. Chariot racing. The Roman NASCAR. Each race had up to 12 chariots, small, wooden, and wildly unstable. Drivers wrapped the reins around their waists, meaning if they crashed, they were usually dragged to death. And yet they were celebrities. Charioteers like Gaius Appuleius Diocles became the richest athletes in Roman history, reportedly earning what would be over $15 billion today. Crowds adored them, bet fortunes on them, and occasionally rioted when their favorite lost. Because what's civilization without some public chaos? Theaters, plays, and problematic humor. Not all Roman entertainment involved mortal danger. Some of it was cultural. Sort of. The Romans loved plays and comedies, tragedies, and the kind of slapstick humor that wouldn't pass a modern HR meeting. Most plays were adaptations of Greek originals, with Roman touches. More politics, more jokes about in-laws, and more bathroom humor. Actors wore exaggerated masks, danced, sang, and shouted over a rowdy audience that occasionally threw food if they got. Board plays were often performed during festivals, long public, holidays where everyone pretended to honor a god, but mostly wanted the day off work. And then there were the mimes, which were less silent and more scandalous. They mixed crude jokes with improvisation, political jabs, and often, let's say, adult themes. They were like ancient reality TV, terrible, popular, and slightly embarrassing for everyone involved. Feasts, the social Olympics. Now let's glide into the more comfortable side of Roman leisure. Feasting. Banquets were where elites showed off their wealth, and everyone else fantasized about being invited. If you were lucky enough to attend, you'd enter a lavish dining room. Frescoed walls, reclining couches, servants moving silently between courses. A proper cena could last hours. There were rules, etiquette, seating hierarchies. The most important guest sat closest to the host, or the food. Sometimes that was the same thing. Each course grew richer and stranger. First light appetizers, olives, eggs, maybe oysters. Then main dishes, roasted birds, fish, sausages, vegetables cooked in wine and herbs. Then sweets, honey cakes, fruits, nuts, and more wine. Always more wine. The Romans didn't drink it straight. That was barbaric. They diluted it with water, honey, or spices, sometimes even seawater, because apparently hydration was negotiable. At fancier banquets, entertainers performed between courses, musicians, dancers, poets, or trained animals doing tricks. It was social theatre. Who reclined where, who poured the wine, who dared to leave early. And yes, there were vomitoria, but not for the reason you think. They weren't special throwing-up rooms. They were exit passages designed to let people leave quickly, though considering what and how much they ate, the confusion is understandable. The games begin, and then we come to the Gladiator games, the beating heart of Roman entertainment, and the darkest. They began as religious rituals, sacrifices to honor the dead, but over time they evolved into massive public spectacles of violence. Because nothing says piety like throwing two men into an arena with swords. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators. It was an architectural marvel. Marble seats, trapdoors, elevators, and complex stage mechanics that made beasts appear from below. Tickets were free, paid for by the emperor or wealthy sponsors seeking popularity. It was their version of a PR campaign. Vote for me, I'll give you lions. Life of a gladiator. Most gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. They trained in special schools, learning combat styles, sword, spear, net, trident. Each had a distinct look and weapon, almost like a character class in a video game. They fought to entertain, not necessarily to die, though death was always on the table. If a fighter showed skill and bravery, the crowd might spare him. If not, well, thumbs down, curtain call. Some gladiators became famous, adored like modern athletes. They had fans, graffiti, and admirers who threw them flowers. One inscription even reads, "Celadus makes the girls sigh." Apparently, danger was attractive even in 80 CE. Exotic beasts and terrible logistics. Romans had a flair for spectacle, and the games reflected that. They imported exotic animals, lions, elephants, leopards, even hippos, from Africa and Asia. These beasts were paraded, hunted, or pitted against humans in elaborate reenactments. A naval battle, for example, could be staged by flooding the arena. Because why stop at cruelty when you can add engineering? The logistics were staggering. Thousands of animals were killed in a single festival. The environmental impact alone would make any modern conservationist faint, but to Romans it symbolized control, man's domination over nature, empire over wilderness, a grotesque kind of order, dressed up as entertainment. The emperor's role, the emperor always sat front and center. Every roar of the crowd, every victory, every mercy or death, all eyes went to him. He decided the fate of fighters with a gesture. It wasn't just a game, It was theatre of power, a reminder that one man's approval kept the whole empire entertained and obedient. Sometimes emperors even joined in. Commodus famously fought as a gladiator, though his opponents were told not to actually fight back. He won every time, of course, because nothing says divine authority like beating up a terrified slave for show, the softer side of leisure. Not all Romans were bloodthirsty, though. Some preferred poetry recitals, garden walks, or philosophical discussions. They visited libraries, attended lectures, and debated abstract ideas like virtue and destiny. Seneca, the philosopher, warned that too much entertainment dulled the mind. Marcus Aurelius probably agreed. Between lectures on Stoicism and his private notes about wishing everyone would calm down. Still, even the philosophers had to admit, a little bread and circus kept the peace. Festivals and holidays. Rome was full of public holidays, hundreds in fact. Many honored gods, but all involved food, games, and some level of public intoxication. During Saturnalia, for example, social order flipped. Masters served slaves, gifts were exchanged, and people wore silly hats. It was part carnival, part chaos, all hangover. The logic was simple. Give people moments to indulge, and the rest of the year they'll behave. A social pressure valve disguised as a holiday. When the empire slept as night fell after the games, Rome was exhausted. The arena was silent. The streets were full of wine fumes and the shuffle of sandals. People returned to their cramped rooms, stomachs full, heads buzzing with noise and spectacle. The empire slept, not peacefully but content enough, and maybe that was the secret. Keep them fed, keep them entertained, keep the illusion alive that life, however rough, still had a bit of theatre left in it. Because in Rome, living was performance. You worked, you ate, you watched, and in doing so you kept the empire's heartbeat steady, one loaf and one cheer at a time. Hygiene, smells, and cleanliness in the Victorian era. Let's start gently. The Victorians are often remembered for their manners, the polished speech, the corsets, the porcelain skin, the constant repression of emotions and sneezes. But under all that lace and lace-up morality was a population that didn't quite understand how hygiene works. This was an age that gave us the telegraph, railways and photography, but also cholera outbreaks, arsenic wallpaper, and people bathing once a week if they were feeling ambitious. Because while the Victorians were obsessed with being clean, they weren't quite sure what clean meant yet. The world before plumbing, imagine, waking up in a London tenement around 1850. The room small, dark and cold. Your bed stuffed with horsehair. There's frost on the inside of the window, because heating is mostly wishful thinking. Outside, horses clop by, dropping, well, fertilizer all over the cobblestones. Now, where do you bathe? If you're poor, the answer is you don't, not really. You might splash your face with cold water from a communal pump. You might wipe your hands and call it good. Full body baths were rare luxuries. If you're middle class, you might have a portable tin tub you fill with water from the stove. You'd bathe once a week and on Saturday, in the same water the rest of the family used in order of seniority. So congratulations. If you're the youngest, you're basically soup stock, and if you're wealthy, you have servants to haul gallons of water up from the kitchen, bucket by bucket, and pour it into a ceramic tub. By the time it's full, it's lukewarm at best. You bathe surrounded by gilt mirrors, floral wallpaper, and the faint dread of cholera. The great toilet problem now about waste. Early Victorians didn't have indoor plumbing. They had chamber pots, porcelain bowls kept under the bed. When full, they were emptied into cesspits, gutters, or rivers. Yes, the same rivers people got their drinking water from. London's Thames was basically a biological weapon by 1850. It smelled so bad they called it the Great Stink. Politicians fled Parliament because the air inside was unbreathable. Eventually, Engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed London's modern sewer system, an underground network that saved the city from drowning in its own waste. He was basically the unsung superhero of sanitation, though at the time no one appreciated him enough to name a cologne after him. Soap and the rise of cleanliness. Culture soap existed, of course, but it was harsh, made from animal fat and lye. It burned skin, stripped oils, and smelled like regret. By the mid-1800s, soap makers like Lever Brothers, who later became Unilever, started marketing toilet soap and not a gentler, scented version. Suddenly, washing wasn't just for necessity, it was moral. Victorian advertisements claimed that clean skin meant good character. Dirty people weren't just unwashed, they were untrustworthy. Soap became a symbol of civilization, often used to justify colonialism, bringing cleanliness to the world, as if bubbles could fix imperial guilt. So yes, Victorians scrubbed themselves into moral superiority, at least on the days they remembered to. Clean clothes, dirty bodies. Interestingly, Victorians often cleaned their clothes far more often than their bodies. Outer garments were brushed, sponged, and aired constantly. Underwear, usually long cotton or linen chemises, was meant to absorb sweat and protect fancy clothes from actual contact with human skin. So rather than wash your body, you just changed your underlayers. It was like living inside your own laundry system, and for women, with corsets, petticoats, and layers upon layers of fabric, bathing wasn't just inconvenient, it was a logistical nightmare. Getting undressed was practically a team sport. Bathhouses and the weekly dip public bathhouses became popular in industrial cities. Workers paid a small fee to use them, part hygiene, part social event. Some offered separate rooms for men and women. Others just hoped everyone behaved. Victorians also embraced Turkish baths, inspired by the Ottoman hammam, steamy, perfumed and just exotic enough to feel scandalous but still respectable. At home, wealthier families might have sponge baths. They'd stand near the fire, wash one section at a time, and hope the maid didn't walk in with visitors mid-rinse. Because modesty was sacred, even while covered in suds, perfume, powder, and deodorant substitutes. Since daily bathing wasn't standard, the Victorians developed creative solutions. They powdered their wigs, perfumed their gloves, dabbed rosewater behind their ears, and sprinkled lavender on sheets. Men used cologne heavily, musk, bergamot, sandalwood, enough to knock out small animals. Women carried vinaigrettes, tiny bottles of aromatic vinegar, to sniff in crowded rooms or when fainting from too many corset laces. Actual deodorant didn't appear until the 1880s, and early versions were acidic and burned the skin, so most people just hoped strong perfume could overpower human biology. It didn't. Victorian dentistry, or lack thereof, now about teeth. Victorian dental care was an ongoing tragedy. Toothbrushes existed made with boar bristles and bone handles. Tooth powders were common, usually chalk, salt, or baking soda. Some added burnt breadcrumbs for texture, which is ironic since that's also what ruined their teeth in the first place. Sugar consumption skyrocketed with the tea craze, and dentistry did not keep up. Most adults lost several teeth by midlife. Dentures were made from ivory or worse, human teeth taken from corpses after battles. They were called Waterloo teeth, which is somehow both horrifying and patriotic. So if someone in a Victorian portrait looks stern and tight-lipped, it's probably not a personality trait. Hair care, Victorian-style hair at least, was treated with care. Victorians brushed it constantly, 100 strokes a day, they said, to keep it glossy. But washing? Rare, maybe once a month, with egg yolks or beer or vinegar. Soap was too harsh and shampoo was barely invented. Women used pomades and oils scented with flowers or lemon. Men used bear grease or macassar oil. which left greasy stains on furniture, leading to the invention of the antimacassar, those little doilies on the back of chairs. So yes, if you've ever wondered why old furniture has lacy covers, it's because Victorian men couldn't stop leaking. The class divide of cleanliness, like everything in the 19th century, was about class. The wealthy could afford servants, perfumed soaps, and regular bathing. They could buy fine linens, imported fragrances, and travel to seaside resorts for restorative air. The poor lived in overcrowded housing, shared privies, and struggled to keep anything clean. Disease spread quickly. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. Mothers boiled clothes in lye, scrubbed floors with sand, and hoped no one got sick. Public health reformers like Florence Nightingale and Edwin Chadwick fought to change that. They argued that cleanliness wasn't luxury, it was life-saving. Slowly, sanitation improved. Slowly, people stopped thinking illness came from bad air and started blaming germs. It was progress. Slow, soapy progress. Germ theory changes everything. In the mid to late 1800s, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister discovered that diseases were caused by microorganisms, not moral failings or swamp fumes. This changed everything. Hospitals began sterilizing instruments. Doctors started washing their hands sometimes. Soap became science instead of superstition. Lister introduced carbolic acid as a disinfectant during surgery, saving countless lives, though it did make operating rooms smell like vinegar and regret. For the first time, cleanliness wasn't just fashion, it was medicine. The scent of civilization by the end of the century. The idea of hygiene had become moral, medical, and social all at once. Perfume companies flourished. Soap was advertised as the mark of a true lady or proper gentleman. Children were told that dirt led to disease and possibly eternal damnation. The bathroom, once an afterthought, became a symbol of progress, tiled, bright, modern. Running water slowly replaced buckets. Plumbing crept into homes, along with the quiet comfort of not having to dump a chamber pot out the window at midnight. It was, at last, a step toward the world we know, though it took a few centuries and a few million germs to get there. The quiet irony, and yet, for all their moralizing and perfumed self-importance, most Victorians still lived surrounded by filth. Coal soot coated every surface. Factories poured smoke into the sky. The streets ran with mud, manure, and mystery liquids. Their obsession with cleanliness was, in some ways, a desperate reaction, a way to carve out tiny islands of order in a world that constantly smelled like horse droppings and damp wool. They couldn't control the chaos of industrial life, but they could polish a doorknob until it gleamed. The sleepy ending, so as the lamps dim in our imaginary parlor, and the last sounds of horse hooves fade into fog. Maybe the real charm of the Victorian age isn't the lace or the tea, or even the invention of plumbing. Maybe it's the quiet persistence, the endless human effort to make life a little cleaner, a little better, even when surrounded by coal smoke and confusion. They didn't always succeed, but they tried. And that in its own grimy, perfumed way feels kind of noble. Victorian feasts and strange foods. When dinner got ambitious, picture this: a long mahogany table, glittering with silverware, candles flickering like tiny ghosts, and a centerpiece so tall you can't actually see the person sitting across from you. That was dinner in the Victorian upper class. Half meal, half performance art, and 100% exhausting, and at the same time, just a few blocks away, working-class families were scraping together bread crusts and watery broth. Because in the Victorian age, what you ate said everything about who you were, and sometimes how long you'd live. So let's start at the top and with the feasts of the rich, before we drift down into the coal-dusted kitchens of everyone else. dining like a Duke Victorian aristocrats loved food. They didn't necessarily understand nutrition, but they understood excess. A proper dinner party wasn't just a meal. It was social theatre. Invitations were handwritten. The number of forks on the table could signal your family's social worth. And the menus, printed in French naturally, could run to 12 or 15 courses. It began with soup, then fish, then entree, which confusingly meant something before the main course, then a remove, basically another main course to replace the first one. Then roasts, game, puddings, jellies, fruit and sweets, and everything had to arrive piping hot, even though the kitchen might be 2 floors away. That's why servants were constantly running through hallways like underpaid marathoners, the Victorian obsession with presentation. The Victorians believed that food should look as dramatic as possible. It wasn't enough to roast a pheasant. You had to reassemble it, feathers and all, before serving. A whole boar's head might appear on the table, mouth open, apple clenched between teeth. Fish were posed as if leaping from waves made of mashed potatoes. It was, to put it kindly, a lot. They decorated dishes with dyed aspic, that shimmering gelatinous glaze made from boiled animal bones. Everything had to shine. Jellied calves' feet, moulded tongue, glazed eels, all carefully arranged under candlelight to remind everyone that, yes, Britain ruled the world, and gelatin ruled dinner, and because this was the age of the empire, ingredients arrived from everywhere. Sugar from the Caribbean, spices from India, oranges from Spain, pineapples from greenhouses called pineries, where one fruit could take years to grow and was used more as decoration than dessert. If your table had a pineapple centerpiece, congratulations, you were visibly rich. You didn't even have to eat it. You could rent one for the evening. The meat mountain Victorian meals were heavily carnivorous: beef, mutton, pork, veal, venison, and often all of the above in a single sitting. Vegetables were considered a side thought, something to decorate the plate rather than nourish the body. Doctors even warned that too many greens could overstimulate the nerves, so the Victorians ate meat at breakfast, meat at lunch, and meat at dinner, washed down with gravy, wine, and moral superiority, and they loved to boast about it. Menus listed elaborate roasts like Baron of beef, a double sirloin, haunch of venison, or boar's head with Madeira sauce. If it had once breathed, it could be served. Drinks and dainties as for beverages. Water was risky, since it might contain more life forms than your backyard pond. So Victorians drank beer, wine, port, sherry, or table water, which was really just slightly cleaner water in a fancy bottle. Tea was the national fuel. Coffee was fashionable, and the punch bowl, was the centerpiece of every respectable gathering. A classic punch combined brandy, rum, citrus, sugar, and hot water, then floated citrus slices and maybe a flaming sugar loaf on top. Nothing said refined civilization like setting your drink on fire. Dessert, or architectural ambition dessert, was an art form. There were molded jellies in rainbow layers, sugar sculptures shaped like temples, candied fruits, trifles, puddings, and custards, ice cream, still new and rare, were served in silver molds shaped like fish, birds, or pineapples. The Victorians couldn't resist turning food into sculpture, but pudding, real pudding, was the heart of dessert. Plum pudding at Christmas, bread pudding for the humble, suet pudding made with beef fat for those who wanted their dessert to fight back a little. The Christmas pudding ritual, stirring clockwise for good luck, hiding coins inside, was almost sacred. Everyone in the family took a turn, which was charming, until someone accidentally swallowed the penny. The long, slow dinner routine now. Dinner wasn't just about food, it was about pacing. Formal dinners could last hours. Guests would sit through endless courses, each one served, cleared, and replaced with precise timing. Conversation had to stay polite, witty, and absolutely scandal-free. No one discussed money, no one discussed bodily functions, and no one, under any circumstances, mentioned how full they were. When dinner finally ended, the ladies retired to the drawing room to drink tea, while the men stayed behind for port and cigars, and some very gentlemanly gossip. Then, and only then, was the evening considered complete. It's easy to imagine the servants quietly collapsing once everyone left. The middle class makes it home, as industrial wealth spread. The middle class began copying the upper class. They couldn't afford 20 servants, but they could manage 5. Cookbooks like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management became essential reading. It told you how to boil, roast, and carve, but also how to manage servants, discipline children, and run your home like a small empire. Mrs. Beeton's recipes were ambitious: calf's head pie, pigeon stew, ale soup, the sort of meals that sound fancy until you remember they involve a face. Middle-class families tried to host dinner parties, though sometimes the French menus didn't quite translate. There's a certain charm in imagining a clerk's wife in Manchester serving cold mutton in aspic and calling it à la mode. But it was about aspiration, not accuracy. Food became a way to climb the social ladder, one questionable jelly mold at a time. Working-class meals now. Let's drift downward, to the neighborhoods where life smelled less like roast beef and more like coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Working-class families ate simply. Bread, potatoes, onions, and whatever could be stretched across a week. Stew was a favorite, because you could keep adding water and pretending it was new. Street food was common: pies, roasted chestnuts, fried fish. In fact, the Victorian era gave birth to Britain's most beloved comfort food: fish and chips. It was cheap, filling, and could be eaten without cutlery, which helped when you didn't own much of either. Children often ate bread soaked in tea for breakfast, and maybe porridge if things were good. For the poor, sugar was a small luxury. 1 spoon in your tea could feel like happiness, and if you could afford a bit of bacon on Sunday, you were doing well. Odd Victorian dishes, of course. The Victorians also had a taste for the bizarre. There were dishes like mock turtle soup, made from calf's head instead of turtle, because nothing says pretend luxury like simmered brain. Jugged hare, rabbit stewed in its own blood, because waste not, want not. Boiled calf's feet jelly, both dessert and medical tonic. Anchovy toast, deviled kidneys, and oxtail soup, all considered breakfast foods. Yes, breakfast. Victorians didn't mess around in the morning. Eating etiquette and class performance. Every meal was also a moral performance. Good pasture. No elbows on the table. No slurping, gulping, or showing enthusiasm for food. Even children were trained to eat silently, 1 bite at a time, knife in the right hand, fork in the left, and eyes down. Dinner wasn't just nourishment. It was obedience practice. Servants stood silently by, refilling glasses or whisking away plates before anyone noticed they existed. For the upper class, invisibility was the highest compliment a servant could earn. It's strange. Really, they built entire dining rituals around pretending not to see the people making it possible. The smells of the Victorian kitchen. Let's drift now into the kitchen. A different world entirely. Hot, smoky, noisy. Copper pots hung in rows. The air thick with boiling fat, coal soot and steam. Servants worked from dawn till midnight, hauling water, peeling vegetables, roasting meats, baking bread. Kitchen maids slept beside the hearth. The scullery maid's job, washing dishes in freezing water with lye soap, was considered punishment from God. Still, the kitchen was the warmest room in the house. And for the servants, it was where laughter and gossip lived. A small rebellion of humanity below the grand. Silent dining rooms upstairs. The birth of comfort food. By the late 19th century, as industrial cities grew, life became harder, longer hours, less rest, more anxiety. People began craving simpler, heartier meals. Pies, puddings, stews, things that felt nostalgic and grounding. This is when comfort food truly began, a return to warmth in a cold, mechanical age, rice pudding, bread and butter pudding, custard, all inexpensive, all filling or slightly bland. Exactly what a weary mind wanted after a day of factory noise or endless propriety. The ritual of tea time, and then there was tea. Our tea, the anchor of Victorian sanity. Introduced earlier in Britain but perfected in the Victorian era, tea became the daily pause, a small, civilized moment amid the chaos. Tea at 4 o'clock. Cucumber sandwiches, scones, clotted cream, or if you were poor, just the tea itself, sometimes brewed 3 times from the same leaves. It wasn't just about taste. It was ritual. Boil the water, warm the pot. Pour slowly, add milk, never first. Because in the Victorian world, even comfort had rules. The slow fade by the end of the century, things were changing. Industrialization brought canned food, mass sugar, and imported ingredients. Cooking became quicker, though not necessarily healthier. Middle-class homes gained stoves and running water. Dinner parties shrank to 6 courses, still impressive but mercifully shorter. And as germ theory spread, hygiene entered the kitchen. People washed hands before cooking. Surfaces were scrubbed. The smell of coal gave way slowly to the smell of soap. It was a quiet revolution. 1 cup of tea at a time, the sleepy reflections. As the last candle flickers out on this long Victorian dinner table, we're left with a scene that's equal parts elegance and exhaustion, all that ceremony, all that ritual, and underneath it, just human beings trying to make sense of their place in a rapidly changing world. They didn't always eat well. They didn't always understand nutrition, but they cared deeply about the meaning of a meal. Whether it was a duke's 12-course feast or a worker's single slice of bread, food carried memory, comfort, and the illusion of control. And maybe that's what we all chase. Even now, a warm plate, a full stomach, and a moment where the world feels just for a bit in order. Exotic foods and feasts in ancient Rome. How to dine like a god and sometimes a lunatic. Let's set the scene. It's around the year 50 CE. You're in Rome at first, or maybe in one of those sprawling villas just outside the city, where the air smells of olive oil, smoke, and ambition. The sun has set. Marble floors are cool underfoot. Servants glide quietly through corridors carrying silver platters, while in the atrium, musicians pluck lyres and try not to make eye contact with anyone too powerful. Because this isn't just dinner. This is the cena, the Roman evening feast, and it could range from a simple family meal to a 12-hour endurance test of gluttony, gossip, and half-cooked philosophy. The 3-part meal, gustatio, cena, secundae mensae Roman dining had structure. Not chaos, ceremony. Dinner started with the gustatio, or appetizer course, eggs, olives, salad, and something sharp to awaken the appetite. Then came the cena itself, the main sequence of dishes which could include meat, fish, grains, and sauces. Finally, the secundae mensae, dessert, fruit, nuts, honey cakes, and sometimes more meat, because why not? It was less about satisfaction and more about abundance. If you could serve more than anyone could possibly eat, it meant you were doing life correctly. The Romans had a phrase for it, abundantia, abundance as a virtue. They worshipped it almost as much as their gods, eating positions and table manners, or lack thereof. The Romans didn't sit to eat, they reclined. 3 couches arranged around a low table called a triclinium. Guests lay on their left sides, propped up on cushions, eating with their right hands. Each couch held 3 people, 9 diners total, the ideal number for a proper gathering. Too few looked lonely. Too many looked greedy. And yes, eating while lying down is as awkward as it sounds. Food dripped, wine spilled, dogs waited nearby for gravity to do its work. But it looked dignified, and that was what mattered. Napkins existed, usually linen, though they weren't exactly used for hygiene. Guests often took them home after dinner, stuffed with leftover delicacies as parting gifts. It was the ancient Roman version of sneaking pastries from the buffet, bread and the basics. For all their luxury, Romans adored simplicity too. Bread was the heart of every meal, usually made of wheat or barley. Poorer citizens ate coarse bread with bits of bran. The wealthy preferred fine white loaves. Sieved and soft olives, cheese and fruit rounded out the basics. Watered wine was standard. Pure wine was considered barbaric, something only Gauls or bad poets would drink. It was mixed with water in a large bowl, sometimes scented with honey or herbs, and poured by a cupbearer, whose job it was to keep the conversation lubricated but civilized. The meats of power now, the main courses, where things got experimental. Romans loved meat, but it wasn't everyday fare. For the lower classes, meat was rare, literally and figuratively. They mostly ate grains, beans, vegetables, and a bit of fish when they could. But the elite, they treated animals like trophies. At grand banquets, you might find dormice, yes, tiny rodents, stuffed with nuts and honey and roasted. A delicacy, apparently. Peacock. Feathers included for presentation. The meat itself was dry, but the display mattered. Flamingo tongues served as luxury appetizers because only the rarest parts of rare birds were worth showing off. Boar's head glazed and displayed whole. Sow's udder, a prized dish for texture if you can imagine what that means. Lamb's brains, sometimes mixed with eggs into a custard-like paste, basically. If it moved, the Romans found a way to eat it. Name it after a god, and convince everyone it was delicious. The Roman obsession with fish sauce, garum, but the true signature of Roman cooking wasn't meat or grain. It was garum, a fermented fish sauce that went on absolutely everything, made by layering fish intestines, salt and herbs in the sun for months until it liquefied. Garum was the ketchup, soy sauce, and secret ingredient of the empire. The smell was reportedly unforgettable. Factories producing it were usually built outside city limits for obvious reasons. Yet garum was a prized export, shipped in amphorae all over the Roman world. A single drop could transform a stew, a sauce, or, depending on your luck, your appetite. The wealthiest Romans bought premium garum made from specific fish species, mackerel or tuna, the vintage editions of the condiment world. Wine and eternal hangovers. Romans drank wine constantly, but rarely straight. It was always diluted with water, sometimes spiced or sweetened with honey. For elite dinners, wine came from specific regions. Falernian, Caecuban, Massic, names that still carried weight centuries later. They aged it in clay jars, sealed with resin or pitch, which gave it a smoky tang. And while the rich debated which amphora tasted best, most of the population drank whatever was cheap and sour. Wine wasn't just recreation, it was necessity, safer than water. By the late Republic, drunkenness was common, but frowned upon in public. Unless, of course, you were an emperor, in which case no one dared mention it. The sweet side, honey, fruit, and luxury sugar didn't exist yet, so honey was the Roman sweetener of choice. They poured it on everything: bread, cheese, meats, even wine. Desserts often featured dates, figs, or pomegranates, fruits imported from the far corners of the empire. One favorite treat was globuli, little cheese balls fried in oil and soaked in honey. Another was dulce domestica, dates stuffed with nuts, sprinkled with salt and baked until syrupy. It sounds rustic now, But in a marble dining room surrounded by statues of gods, it felt like ambrosia. Feasts of excess. When dinner became theatre, some Roman banquets crossed the line from indulgence into surreal performance art. Take Emperor Vitellius, who supposedly held feasts that cost the modern equivalent of millions. He once served a dish made from the livers of pike, the brains of pheasants, the tongues of flamingos and the milk of lampreys, because moderation was for other people. Then there was Elagabalus, the teenage emperor who delighted in pranks. He served guests peas made of jade, grapes carved from glass, and gold coins baked into bread. At one feast, he allegedly released live leopards into the dining room just to see what would happen. It's safe to say ancient Rome had no health and safety department. Salads, sauces, and strange combinations. Roman taste wasn't quite like ours. They loved mixing sweet, sour, and salty flavors in ways that would baffle modern palates. A typical sauce might include honey, vinegar, fish sauce, wine, pepper, and cumin, all in the same bowl. The result was complex, tangy, and occasionally confusing. They also adored mixing fruit with meat, pears with pork, apricots with lamb, figs with chicken. For texture, they'd add crushed nuts or breadcrumbs, the ancient equivalent of crunch. Roman chef Apicius, whose cookbook survives today, included recipes like stuffed piglet with honey and wine sauce and flamingo stew. His culinary motto was essentially, if it exists, stuff it and roast it. Dining with the emperors, if you were lucky, or unlucky as enough to dine with an emperor. The experience could be both luxurious and nerve-wracking. Emperor Augustus preferred modest meals, cheese, figs, and a little fish, a humble style meant to contrast with his power. Nero, on the other hand, dined as if the world existed solely for his pleasure. He allegedly spent fortunes on imported delicacies, while Rome literally burned outside. And Caligula, well, he once invited guests to dinner and then executed them mid-meal, just to prove he could. That's one way to end awkward small talk. For emperors, food wasn't nourishment. It was domination served on a silver plate. Ordinary Romans ate differently. Let's leave the marble halls and walk down to the streets, the insulae, where ordinary Romans lived in apartment blocks and cooked on small hearths, if at all. Most people didn't have kitchens. They ate at street stalls or thermopolia, ancient snack bars with big stone counters and pots sunk into them. There you could grab bread, beans, lentils, or warm wine on your way home from the baths. Breakfast, ientaculum, was usually bread and cheese. Lunch, prandium, was light, maybe leftovers or cold meat. Dinner, cena, even for the poor, was sacred, a chance to sit, eat, and talk. Their meals were humble, but they had something the elites often didn't: simplicity. No flamingos required. The politics of food in Rome wasn't just pleasure, it was propaganda. Emperors kept the people happy with panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Free grain distributions, lavish public banquets, and games at the Colosseum kept the masses fed and distracted. Augustus famously imported grain from Egypt to feed millions. Trajan hosted feasts that could feed thousands at once. It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. A full stomach was less likely to rebel, so every loaf of bread carried a message. The empire provides. The emperor cares. Don't ask questions. Decadence and decay as the empire aged, so did its appetites. Feasts grew larger, stranger, and more absurd. Luxury became both obsession and weakness. Writers like Seneca complained that Rome had lost its discipline, that people cared more about sources than virtue. He wasn't entirely wrong. By the 4th century, when supplies tightened and invasions loomed, lavish dining seemed almost delusional, the empire's last great performance before the lights went out. Yet even then, recipes survived. People still gathered, still ate, still shared wine and conversation. Because for all their madness, the Romans understood something timeless. Food is how you remember being human. The sleepy reflection, so now picture it one last time. The flickering oil lamps, the smell of honey and spice, the laughter echoing under painted ceilings. Somewhere a servant carries a tray of figs, someone toasts the gods or luck or love, and for a brief shimmering moment, the entire chaotic empire pauses just to eat. It's both familiar and distant, ancient and deeply human. They may have had strange tastes, dormice, garum and all, but behind the spectacle was something gentle, the same quiet desire we still have. To gather, to share, to fill the silence with warmth, and maybe a little too much wine. The life of Marcus Aurelius, 121–180 CE. The Stoic emperor who didn't want to be one. A boy in the marble city. It begins, as many Roman stories do, in a house of quiet wealth and serious people. Marcus Annius Verus was born in Rome on April 26, 121 CE. The empire was near its height, roads stretched across continents, and trade ships carried goods from Britain to Egypt. But Marcus's childhood wasn't filled with games or luxury. His family belonged to the old senatorial elite, proud, disciplined, and careful about everything. When he was little, they called him Verissimus, the truest one, because even as a child, Marcus seemed different, honest to a fault, calm. He didn't seek the loud joys of Roman boyhood, chariot races, gambling, mischief. He preferred books, animals, and long silences. He studied Greek and Latin before most children could write. He read philosophy, while other boys fought mock battles with wooden swords. Some adults whispered that he was too gentle for Rome. They were right, but fate had other plans. The tutor and the Stoics, when Marcus was about 12, he discovered something that would change him forever: Stoicism. A philosopher named Junius Rusticus introduced him to the works of Epictetus, a former slave who taught that peace comes not from wealth or comfort, but from controlling how we react to what happens. The Stoics believed in a universe governed by reason, a vast, living order where everything happens for a purpose, even pain, even death. And so young Marcus began to train his mind like a soldier trains his body. He practiced discipline, humility, endurance. He slept on hard beds, wore simple clothes, and taught himself to accept whatever came. He wrote reminders to himself in notebooks. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. These weren't words for the world. They were instructions to himself, a boy learning how to stay calm in a storm he didn't yet know was coming. The reluctant heir in 138 CE, Emperor Hadrian, old and ailing, named his successor, Antoninus Pius, a gentle, steady man with no children of his own. But there was a catch. Hadrian made Antoninus adopt 2 heirs. One of them was Marcus. Marcus didn't want it. He wanted philosophy, not politics. But Rome didn't care what he wanted. Duty was destiny. At 17, he became Marcus Aurelius, adopted son of the emperor, future ruler of the world. He studied governance, law and military affairs, but he still found time to read Greek at night, writing to himself about humility, compassion, and self-control. Where other heirs threw parties, Marcus read Plato. Where others flaunted gold, he wore a plain cloak. And though Rome adored him for his virtue, he often felt like a stranger in his own palace. Faustina and family Marcus married Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, a political match, but one that over time grew into a real affection. She was spirited, outspoken, and often restless, while Marcus was quiet and introspective. They were opposites, but their marriage lasted over 30 years. They had at least 13 children. Most died young, of fever, illness, or fate's casual cruelty. Marcus rarely wrote about his grief, but you can feel it between the lines of his meditations. When you kiss your child, whisper to yourself, "They may not be here tomorrow," yet love them as if they will be forever. He didn't write this out of coldness, but from a desperate wish to survive heartbreak with dignity, to love the world, he believed, was to accept its impermanence. Emperor against his will when Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus was 40 years old, steady, thoughtful, and reluctant. He begged the Senate to let him rule jointly with his adopted brother, Lucius Verus. It was the first time in Roman history that the empire had two emperors. Marcus didn't seek power. He saw it as a responsibility. He treated the imperial palace not as a throne, but as a duty post. Yet the universe, as always, tested him. War on the frontiers, almost as soon as he took the purple robe, the world caught fire. In the east, the Parthian Empire invaded Roman Syria. Lucius Verus led the campaign, while Marcus stayed in Rome, managing the empire's vast machinery. The war ended in Roman victory, but returning soldiers brought back something deadlier than swords: plague. Historians call it the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, and it swept across the empire, killing millions. Farms emptied. Legions weakened. Cities fell silent. Through it all, Marcus stayed calm, patient, and present. He gave away his own fortune to help victims, sold palace treasures to fund relief, and reminded himself daily that nothing human was ever truly his to keep. Do not be surprised when life treats you harshly. The universe was never meant to serve your comfort. The northern wars, as if plague weren't enough, the northern borders of the empire erupted in rebellion. Germanic tribes crossed the Danube, burning towns and threatening Italy itself. Marcus could have sent generals to handle it. Instead, he went himself. For nearly a decade, the emperor lived in a soldier's camp, sleeping on the ground, eating army rations, and writing his thoughts in the quiet between battles. Those thoughts became his meditations, a private journal never meant to be published. In a cold tent on the frontier, he wrote to himself by lamplight, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." He never complained about hardship. He didn't boast of victories. He simply endured, believing that virtue meant doing your duty, even when no one applauded. Inside his mind-reading meditations today feels like eavesdropping on the soul of a weary, wise man. He questions himself constantly. Am I too angry? Too proud? Too indulgent? He reminds himself to stay gentle, even with fools, to forgive insults, to remember how small we all are beneath the stars. Soon you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you. This wasn't despair. It was freedom. If nothing lasts, then the only thing that matters is how you act in each moment. No empire, no marble statue, no title will survive time. But kindness does, for as long as it can be felt. The death of Verus in 169 CE, his co-emperor Lucius Verus died suddenly, perhaps from the plague. Now Marcus ruled alone. He didn't celebrate. He simply carried on. The wars continued. The frontier demanded his presence again. He spent winters among soldiers, watching snow fall over the Danube, writing in his notebook about patience and acceptance. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The burden of Commodus among Marcus's surviving children was Commodus, his son and heir, a boy who would one day undo much of what his father built. Marcus loved him, but even he sensed trouble. Commodus was impulsive, spoiled by privilege, and fascinated by the spectacle of the gladiator arena. Where Marcus sought peace, Commodus sought applause. Still, Marcus hoped his philosophy would pass on, that wisdom could be inherited. It rarely can. The end of the philosopher by 179 CE, Marcus was exhausted. Years of war, grief, and disease had worn him down. He fell ill near the city of Vindobona, modern Vienna. His generals begged him to rest. He smiled and said, "Why do you weep for me instead of thinking about the pestilence and the common lot of all?" He died quietly on March 17, 180 CE. He was 58. The soldiers mourned not with fanfare but with silence. For once, Rome had lost a ruler who did not seek to be remembered, and so he was remembered forever. The emperor who looked inward, Marcus Aurelius, wasn't a conqueror like Caesar. He wasn't a builder like Augustus. He was something rarer, a man who ruled himself before ruling others. He believed that life is short, that anger is wasteful, that fame is an illusion, and that love, quiet, patient love, is the only thing worth carrying through the storm. He left behind no grand speeches, no self-glorifying monuments, only a slim book of notes scribbled in the dark, that still whispers across 2,000 years, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." The slow reflection. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the old emperor sitting alone by a dying campfire. The wind moves through the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, soldiers murmur in their sleep. Marcus watches the flames shrink to embers. He closes his eyes and thinks of Rome, its noise, its marble, its endless hunger. And then he breathes calmly, as he always tried to, and reminds himself everything changes. Everything ends. But for this moment, the world is enough. Prologue. The empire that never slept. When we left Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the Roman Empire was still holding its breath. Vast, proud, but quietly tired, he had spent his life holding back the chaos, the plague, the wars, the ambition of others. And for a moment it worked. For a moment, the empire still believed it was eternal. But history has a way of whispering reminders. Everything that grows eventually ages, and Rome, magnificent Rome, was about to start forgetting what made it Rome at all. The empire at its peak, let's pause here, in the late 2nd century CE. The empire stretches from the sands of Egypt to the misty hills of Britain. 60 million people, hundreds of cities, temples, and roads. The Mediterranean isn't a sea anymore. It's a Roman lake. If you were alive then, you'd have seen a world of polished marble, baths steaming with perfumed water, and markets bursting with spices from halfway across the world. To the casual observer, this looked like forever. Empires always do right before they crack, because while the buildings gleamed, the foundation, social, moral, economic, was beginning to tremble. Commodus. The unraveling begins. Marcus Aurelius had one flaw. He believed too much in goodness, and that meant he left the empire to his son, Commodus, a man who thought philosophy was boring and that the gladiator arena was the real Senate. Commodus wanted applause, not wisdom. He dressed as Hercules, carried a club, and demanded that statues of him be placed beside the gods. He renamed months after himself. He charged the state for every appearance he made in the arena. Under his rule, Rome stopped admiring itself and started mocking itself. Senators trembled, assassins plotted, and when one of them finally succeeded in 192 CE, the city breathed a sigh of relief, but the damage was done. The Golden Age, that long calm stretch of Pax Romana, ended with a stab in the dark and a curtain falling on dignity. The crisis of the 3rd century after Commodus came chaos. A century so messy, it feels like a fever dream. From 235 to 284 CE, Rome had over 20 emperors, most of them soldiers who rose through rebellion and died by assassination. It was like a deadly game of musical thrones. Frontiers crumbled. The treasury emptied. Barbarian invasions swept across the Rhine and Danube. Plagues returned. Even the sun itself seemed to fade. Historians speak of a dark age where crops failed and famine followed, and yet life went on. Merchants still traded. Farmers still plowed. Philosophers still wrote. And soldiers still swore allegiance to whichever emperor managed to survive that week. There's a strange, haunting rhythm to Rome's decline. The world collapses, and people still show up for work. Money, debasement, and the price of bread economics, the quiet killer of empires. Rome's coinage, once strong and silver, slowly turned to copper. Each emperor, desperate to fund his armies, mixed more base metal into the currency. The result? Inflation so wild it made a loaf of bread cost more than a soldier's pay. People hoarded gold and stopped trusting coins. Trade slowed. Taxes rose. And soon entire provinces stopped sending tribute. The empire began to eat itself financially, taxing farmers into ruin while still paying for gladiator games. To keep the crowd distracted, bread and circuses, they called it. Feed the people, entertain them, and maybe they won't notice the walls crumbling. Rome the city. From marble to mud by the 3rd century, the city of Rome itself was a paradox, still monumental, but strangely hollow. The marble facades remained, but many of the great buildings were abandoned or repurposed. Temples were turned into workshops. Statues were melted down. Even the Colosseum, once filled with roars and pageantry, became partly a ruin, scavenged for stone. And yet, life persisted. Children played where senators once debated. Goats grazed near crumbling baths. The Tiber carried both water and waste. It wasn't apocalypse. It was erosion, and slow, constant, patient. The kind you don't notice until the marble dust is already in your lungs. Diocletian. The bureaucratic reboot. Then came Diocletian, a man who looked at the chaos and said, "Right, time for spreadsheets." He reorganized everything, divided the empire in half, in east and west, each with its own emperor and co-emperor. He built layers of bureaucracy so thick you could barely find your way through them. He also tried to control prices, fix wages, and stabilize the currency. It half worked, but the real victory was administrative. Diocletian's reforms kept the empire breathing, though it now felt less like a republic and more like a corporation. He ruled with iron discipline, then retired voluntarily to grow cabbages, one of the few Roman emperors to leave office alive. Constantine and the New Rome. Then came Constantine the Great, the man who turned Rome into an idea rather than a place. He legalized Christianity, moved the capital east to Byzantium, and renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was a brilliant move. The east was wealthier, safer, easier to defend. The west, Italy, Gaul, Britain, was becoming too expensive and too exposed. But in doing so, Constantine quietly admitted what no one dared say. Rome itself, the old city, was no longer the heart of the empire. It was now just a symbol, a memory carved in stone. Faith and fragmentation religion changed everything. Christianity spread like wildfire, first among the poor and enslaved, then among nobles and generals. By the 4th century, pagan temples were closing. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, were now considered relics of superstition. The shift wasn't violent at first, but it was deep. Rome's unity had always been cultural. The shared rituals, festivals, sacrifices. When those faded, something fundamental dissolved. The empire no longer believed in its own mythology, and without shared myth, even marble cracks. Barbarians at the gatelets talk about the so-called barbarians, Goths, Vandals, Huns, Franks. They weren't just wild invaders. They were people displaced by other migrations, seeking land, food, safety. For centuries, Rome had hired them as mercenaries. They fought for pay, wore Roman armor, spoke Latin commands. But when the empire grew weak, they stopped fighting for Rome and started fighting for themselves. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, marched into Rome and sacked it. For the first time in 800 years, the eternal city fell to foreign hands. People didn't scream, they wept quietly, because the unimaginable had happened. The center of the world had stopped being safe.